went to United States, where I did my master's and PhD degrees. So after completion of my PhD, I did postdoctoral work at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill for 5 years with Aziz Sancar, and where I exposed myself to DNA repair and biological clock. And I have been working at Koç University since 2004. So today I'm going to talk about my research work, which is going to be about basically circadian clock, and I will try to relate the circadian clock with the evolution. So I can share my screen, right? So okay. So you all know that our basically the solar system has our Earth is basically exhibiting two very rhythmic behavior in the solar system, and basically one is that our Earth is rotating around our sun or star and with a fixed angle, and you all know that that generates a different season depending where you live on the Earth basically. And the second important rhythm that our Earth is exhibiting is basically rotating around its axis, and that generates what we call as dark and night cycle. And at this point, you will immediately realize that basically our and all those rhythmic behaviors generates and totally different environmental factors. And the one that you see here is generating light and dark cycle, and certain time of day we are going to be expose ourselves to light, and the other half is not basically, and that has a really great impact on organismal biology. In addition to that, and the seasons, and you all know that so having a different temperatures, different environmental factors, and so on, and organisms, they have to really adapt in those different seasons and in order to basically use their cellular resources in a very effective manner. So in that sense, and as an organism, we have developed three different important types of rhythm to be able to anticipate all those different environmental conditions. And one of them is what we call circadian rhythms. And circadian rhythms basically that occur once during a 24-hour period. So in other words, and you will see that some of the physiological variables that I'm going to discuss in next few slides is they basically is controlled by this circadian rhythm. In addition to that, an organism, they have also ultradian rhythms, and basically these ultradian rhythms occur more than once a day. So in other words, some of our physiological variables is exhibiting and some type of oscillatory properties and less than 24 hours. And in that sense, the example will be, for example, heartbeat. And you all know that our heart is basically working in a rhythm, is taking less than a second, or enzyme works. Enzyme, they have to find their substrate. It's going to basically perform the catalysis and so on. But throughout our discussion, you'll see that many things are basically working in a very rhythmic manner in that sense. And the last rhythms is developed by organism to be able to cope or those environmental condition is at what we call as infradian rhythms. And this, by definition, infradian rhythms basically occurs once a month or once a season. And classical example will be for that is, the bears, and what they do is basically they go under a hibernation. for 2 or 3 months, especially during the winter season, in order to minimize the food finding of predators and other reasons is basically, and with this way they make sure that they basically survive and in those harsh environmental conditions. And another classical example will be the mammals. And some of the mammals, at least, they basically produces some eggs for the fertilization every 28 days, or depending type of organism, that can be shorter or longer. Okay. So today, what I'm going to do is basically, among all those rhythms, I will spend all my time to discuss about the circadian rhythm. And here you see a definition of circadian rhythms, and circadian rhythms basically are the oscillations in the behavior and the biochemical reaction of an organism, and basically occurs or repeats every 24 hours. Okay, and the circadian is a Latin word, and circa means approximately, dies means a day, and you say circadian, we are talking about basically approximately 1 day. Okay. And the circadian rhythms is pretty much conserved in many different organisms, ranging from all the way to cyanobacteria to the complex multicellular organism. And in microalgae, they have clock, and basically they regulate almost all their physiology based on this circadian rhythm, or based on their light and so on. And here, when we say a circadian rhythm, and that's, as I just said, is a type of oscillation, and that's what you really see here. And I'm going to talk about in a minute, and you'll see that many of our physiological variables is basically exhibiting this oscillatory pattern. And here, this x-axis that you see, this light portion is basically indicates light cycle, and the dark one is referring to the dark cycle, and this is 24 hours, 12-hour light and 12-hour darks. And note that most of our physiology is basically exhibiting such pattern. Okay, from peak to peak, we call period, it's exactly 24 hours. And this is called amplitude. So here we have trough, and then the things are going to basically increase, and what we call as an amplitude. Okay, and also we have a phase of such circadian rhythm. So as I said, many physiological and behavioral processes are under the control, and here I have listed some of them. And if you observe yourself, and you will also see that all those things are basically obeys this works in a circadian dependent manner. And for example, in here, if you see this time atlas in here, that we have highest blood pressure certain period of time, and it's around 8:30. Okay, and also we have highest body temperature, and which is around 7. And then and throughout this time atlas, basically you see that some of things are being really work in a maximum manner during the nighttime, and some of our physiological variables are basically maximized during the daytime. Okay. So since you consider that we're going to have a highest body temperature at a certain point of time, that body temperature is going to be lowest, and that is around 4:30. Therefore, when we sleep, we feel really cold, because our body temperature is going to decrease, and you have to basically maintain our body temperature around 30-70 degrees. So in order to do that, and you have to basically cover up yourself when you sleep. Okay. And bowel movement is also start like in the morning. It's going to be maximized throughout the day, but when you go sleep, our bowel movement that you see around 10:30 is going to be suppressed. So therefore, it's not to eat during the nighttime, because our basically digestive system is basically slow, works in a very slow manner, and it's hard to digest. They don't produce all those enzymes and so on. Okay. In addition to that, the production of important enzymes are also under the control of circadian rhythm. And again, the classical example will be the melatonin secretion or melatonin production. So the reason that we sleep is basically thanks to this hormone, what we call as melatonin. So around 9 p.m. and this melatonin starts to produce. So as soon as that melatonin is produced, it's going to relax us and basically it's going to send the signal to all the cells and put basically organism into the sleep. Okay. So in the morning, this melatonin production will be suppressed and stopped. And then during the daytime, as soon as we receive the light and our body is going to wake up and there will be a huge physiological changes in our cell basically that I'm going to also discuss in the coming slides. Okay. So one of the major questions is that why organisms they possess this clock? And evolutionary perspective, I mean, if you look at in the nature, is that we have billions different organisms, and some of them they do possess clock, but some of them are not. And one classical example will be that a group of scientists over Vanderbilt University, what they did is basically they took cyanobacteria, and what they did is basically they knock out their clock system in a way that they will have a different period length. And then what they did is they took wild type organism and those mutant organisms mixed with each other and to see that really how each mutant and wild type they basically grow. So here, and you see that this is an estimated number of generations and they let those organisms grow and then they did genotyping and to make the long story short, and they discovered that if organisms they have no clock, they cannot survive, and within the time they are going to get extinct. And that totally makes sense because and think about yourself, and if you are not sleeping, if you have any problem with your clock, that I'm going to show also example the disease related with the clock, you will get all kind of different types of disease. And eventually is going to cause the death of organism. So in that sense, having a viable clock is going to increase the survival fitness of that specific organism in a given habitat, basically. So sorry, this is in Turkish, but I mean, you all Turkish, there should be no problem in that sense. And you can see that the hormones that are essential to our the mental health and metabolisms, they are being strictly produced in a circadian time dependent manner. And here you see that, that some of the hormones that are being produced during the daytime, they are going to be produced for a couple hours or 3 hours, depending type of hormones that you can see in this list. And then they will be, their production will be terminated. And in that sense, cortisol is being produced in the morning. This is an extremely important hormones, and it's going to let us deal with different types of stress. Serotonin, and you all know that it's also known as a happiness hormone or so on, and it's allow us to control our needs and so on. And GABA, dopamine, follicle stimulating hormone, gastrin, and thyroid, and so on. And note that each of these hormones that have a very vital functions in cellular metabolisms are strictly being produced during the daytime. In addition to that, there are some hormones like melatonin, growth hormone, or and other hormones are being really produced strictly in the dark or when you are in the sleep. So therefore, the newborns and they like sleep for 20 hours per day, and during that time, what they do is basically they do nothing but produce those growth hormone, and it's going to accelerate the development and growth and so on in newborn babies, basically. After basically introduction of this circadian clock, known as also chronobiology, is really a discipline or science or branch of science. And they have done and several thousand different studies, all different organisms, and they come up with some properties. And this slide is basically indicates you that, that there are three basic properties of circadian rhythm. And one of them is that the circadian rhythm is basically an endogenous system. So in other words, each cell, they have a clock, and that clock works independent than environmental factor. Okay. And the second important property of circadian rhythm is that it has been shown that this endogenous clock is being regulated by environmental factors. So what type of environmental factors basically regulates this the circadian clock or clock of the cell? The one of them is called light. Light is a very important factor that regulates our circadian clock. The second important regulator of clock is social interaction. So, and many organisms, they do live together, and if you look at in the natures, and they live in like a tribal type of conditions. In human, we have friends, we have families, and so on. So when people start to live together and they start to send signal to each other, and that signal is basically is the one also regulate or synchronizes the clock of each basically organism. Okay. And in addition to that, the last important properties of circadian rhythm, it works and it's temperature compensated. So in other words, our clock is not going to be changed by the temperature of external environment. Okay. So, and again, studies also indicated that we have that the circadian clock, they have three important basically components, and one of them is what we call input components. And the one that I have just explained, we have clock in our bodies, and those clocks are being basically regulated by different environmental conditions, and one of them is light and social interaction, and also the feeding. I mean, we eat 3 times a day, right? I hope you eat 3 times a day, and there is a logic behind it, because food means, in cellular perspective, having a different oxidation reduction environment. Or in other words, food means the NAD plus over NADH, and that's about the cell. So cell taking all those food is to regulate the ratio of NADH, NAD plus over NADH, or ADP over ATP ratio. And that directly sends signal to the cellular time machinery, basically. Light, of course, whenever that we wake up and we expose ourselves to the light, and that light information is going to be sensed by our eye and send that information to our brain. And in the brain, we have a clock region, what we call as suprachiasmatic nucleus. So this suprachiasmatic nucleus that I'm going to refer always as an SCN is our master clock body, basically, or site. Okay. So that information is going to be processed at the SCN, and time is going to be resetted. And then after that, that is going to send a message, time message, to all other peripheral cells and synchronize the body cell according to the environmental conditions. So once we have basically the clock has been resetted by this environmental condition, and as I just said, that is all peripheral cells also being resetted, and then our systems like heart, liver, muscle, kidney, and all the things that you can think of are going to have a synchronous time and then start to work at the same time. So this is extremely important, because and if there is no synchronization of time between the different cells, there will be a chaotic environment. Can you think of a situation, let's say your brain is working in maximum capacity, but liver is not? And there will be basically a clash, and there will be a problem, and usually organisms that have such problems, they cannot survive for longer. They get easily aged, and eventually they will die. They have a limited lifetime compared to the organisms that have really a perfect clock, basically. Okay. And in addition to that, of course, sleep-wake cycles are going to be regulated accordingly. The cognitive performance, memory, and many other mental related the activities are also being controlled by the SCN, and make sure that every single cells they have a really a similar time zone and working together. So SCN, and as I said, is a master clock site. It is located in the hypothalamus. And here what you do see is you see a brain of a mouse. And here this is the hypothalamus area. And in hypothalamus area, we have this master clock site called suprachiasmatic nucleus, or SCN. And this SCN consists of basically 20,000 neurons. Okay, so those are the clock generator, or known as a pacemaker. And those pacemakers is going to receive the light information from retina by retinohypothalamic tract. And they're going to basically synchronize the cell. Once they have synchronized the cell, they're going to send the information to all other region in the brain and peripheral cells in order to regulate our body temperature, sleep, mental health, and so on. Okay, so until 1971, and there were like 20,000 papers on all of them try to understand the circadian rhythm or circadian clock at the physiological level. And for sure, they proved that organism, they have clock, but of course, they didn't know how those clocks are being generated at molecular level. And in 1971, and you see the names here, Ronald Konopka and Seymour Benzier, and what they did is basically, and they were trying to identify the genes are responsible for generation of those circadian clock. Okay, so this PhD student Konopka, he worked 10 years for his PhD. And what he did is basically he got those Drosophila organism, he mutagenized those organisms, and then basically he screened those mutants to find an abnormal, some type of a circadian rhythm. That's what he did. He eventually found a bunch of mutants, Drosophila, and they don't have simply a clock. And he used basically this Drosophila. You see the picture of those Drosophila, basically insects. He used basically, he screened like a couple millions of these Drosophila mutants to be able to find the mutant organism they lack basically circadian clock. Okay. So anyhow, so after screening of all those 2 million organisms in 10 years, he basically categorized these mutants into 4 different categories. In one category is basically, he found that some of the mutants, they basically have a perfect circadian rhythms. Remember, oscillations, 24 hours. Not that this organism exhibit this oscillation perfectly. If you measure this peak-to-peak period, you will see it's 24 hours exactly. He found a group of organisms basically and exhibit no circadian rhythm that you see here in the panel B, and it's called this organism as an arrhythmic organism. And in panel C, what he did is basically he identified also a group of organisms where they have a short period. If you do measure the peak to peak, you will see that it's not 24 hours, it's less than 24 hours. And lastly, he identified also a mutant called long period mutant. If you measure their period, it's over 24 hours. So, okay, you have mutants and all this. And then what he did is basically, okay, what genes are being mutated in the chromosome and giving such phenotype. And he used forward genetics, another 3-4 years or something like that. And he was able to map and identified the genes that is responsible for such phenotype, and he named that gene as a period gene. And I think it was a heroic effort at that time, because no molecular biology, nothing, and using just classical genetics, he was able to exactly identify the mutation, location of a mutation on the gene, and name that gene as a period gene. And it was a breakthrough at that time, and open new science, what we call as molecular chronobiology. So when someone makes such a discovery, other group of scientists is jumping into such discovery and try to ask such similar question, whether that gene exists in other organisms. And they have discovered this gene in human, in mammals, let's say, in also cyanobacteria, in plant and other organisms that you can think of. Then, of course, once you have discovered these genes, then the next question that you will ask, are there any genes, clock genes, that are responsible for generating of the circadian clock? And past 30 years, scientists, they do nothing but try to discover all those genes. But at the end, they discovered 4 different genes, basically, and called, one of them is, you already know, is period. The other one is named as clock genes. The other one is cryptochromes, and the other one is basically B-bulk genes. Okay, and cryptochromes is the one that discovered by Aziz Sancar group, basically. So it turns out to be that there are 4 essential genes are required to generate this circadian clock. Then, of course, the next question that you will ask, what is the mechanism? So how those genes is participating and let organism generate a circadian clock. And then Michael Rosbach, Jeffrey Holgroos, what they did is they tried to understand how these the genes product, which are proteins, are interacting with each other and generating basically the circadian clock. And they did the pioneering studies, and they found out that there is a transcriptional, translational feedback loop mechanism is responsible to generate this oscillatory pattern that you see here. And then later on, studies with other organisms basically indicated that, yes, this mechanism is conserved among all those species. And then let's see that the mechanism at the molecular level in mammals. In mammals, what happened is that, as I just said, we have 2 circadian clock proteins called B-malvan and clock. So these B-malvan and clock are being produced, and then what they do is basically is they heterodimerize and binds to the E box within the promoter region of the genes. So as soon as this B-mal and clock binds to a promoter region of a gene on E box, they are going to initiate the transcription of the genes. And that genes what we call as clock control genes. Okay. So so they are going to bind E box and initiate the transcription of clock control genes. Within the time, and that's what you see, the initiation of this, basically the oscillation, and the genes are being transcribed. So in other words, the clock control genes are being produced. And eventually, they are going to reach their maximum production level. Okay? And at that point, what's going to happen is that other clock proteins, transcription factor, what we call as cryptochromes and period proteins, along with casein kinase, epsilon or delta, they are going to form a trimeric structure and then interact with this B-mal and clock. And note that we have here a complex. And then what happens is that if you have this such complex is going to silence the gene. In other words, turn off the clock control genes transcription. And there will be no more transcription, means no more protein production. And it is going to basically close the loop for a circadian clock at the end of 24 hours. And this one is being repeated every day. Clock B-mal comes, increase the transcription of clock control genes, then CRIPER, casein kinase epsilon is going to interact with them and then turn off the transcription. And this is going to be repeated every day and every day. So here, and you have to be basically not forget about these clock control genes. Okay. Is that mechanism simple? No, and there are every day, even our group, we have discovered a lot of the clock genes, and the picture is much more complex that I'm not going to talk about, but you have to appreciate that clock is so important and controls so many transcription of so many genes. There are other proteins are going to basically feed this transcription and feedback loop mechanism in a way that do a fine tuning in our cellular clock, basically. So, as I said at the beginning of this lecture, is that the circadian clock controls so many, every cells that we have in our system has some type of clock. Okay. And those cells, what they do, depending the tissues that you can think of, and each of them is going to perform and some unique function. And each function that are going to be mediated by a different group of these peripheral cells is going to work based on circadian clock. And liver is not working all the time. They do work in their maximum capacity only certain period of time. Our cardiovascular system is not always working at their maximum capacity. They only work with certain period of time, like kidney or fat production and so on. For example, in fat accumulation, we have an adipocyte tissue, and the maximum activity is maximum between 8 o'clock all the way to the 2 o'clock in the morning. So that's why you don't want to eat really during the nighttime, because whatever that you eat is directly going to be sent into the adipocyte in the form of fats. Okay, so therefore, when you are dieting and when you see an expert, they suggest you not to eat after 6 o'clock. That totally makes sense, because during the nighttime, the fat accumulation is maximum, basically. Food absorption, as already briefly mentioned, our digestive system is also working maximum at certain period of time. Okay? So in that sense, the circadian clock controls every system that you can think of based on the time. Why? Simply, when you say works based on time, means you are talking about overall metabolism. When you say metabolism, you are talking about an enzymes. When you say enzymes encoded by the genes, and transcription of majority of those genes are under the control of circadian clock. And then they try to identify what type of genes or what percentage of our genes are being controlled by the circadian clock. And studies indicated that 5 to 10% of all expressed transcripts, either coding or non-coding, are under the control of circadian clock. 20% of proteins, including post-translational modifications, are under the control of circadian clock, and 43% of protein coding genes in at least one organ are under the control of the circadian clock. So in other words, half of our protein coding genes are being produced in a circadian time-dependent manner. So I want to really briefly point out some very useful information and from these studies. And this black circle represent the total genes are being expressed in all those tissues or organs. And note that the red basically circle highlights the number of genes that are being controlled by circadian clock that you see here. You see it's a lot of genes. Okay. And it's around 10,000 genes or so. And also in that studies, what they have done is basically that they also identify the drug target proteins or genes. You all know that the reason that we are taking all those medicine when we got sick, they are going to find eventually a target, which is proteins, and then regulate or modulate their activity, okay? And also in these studies, note that they found out that around 1,000 genes that are for some type of drug targets are under the control of circadian clock. So overall, there are 2,000 targets that you see. Half of them are being controlled by circadian clock machinery. What does that mean? And it means that you're going to take some drugs and you have to make sure that whenever that you take, or you have to know the time exactly when to take those drugs. Because let's say you're randomly taking drug, if there is no target in your cell, there is no reason to take because it's not going to be effective. Okay. And also in that study, what they did is they pick up these top 100 bestseller drugs that you see here. And then what they did is basically they identified their target to see that whether they are under the circadian control or not. And they have found out that 56 of among those hundreds their targets are under the control of what? Circadian clock. And these are the target genes that you see here, or proteins per se, okay? And note that, and each of these targets are being controlled by circadian clock machinery. And nowadays, what we call this chronotherapy, and big pharma companies, what they do is basically, and they are trying to basically find, they're doing this chronotherapy and make sure that the doctors, they are going to prescribe those medicine and for the patients and to take them at the right time in order to increase the effectiveness of those targets, okay? And here you see the top seller drugs, and one of them is like Nexium, and the market value is really huge. And likewise, the others, they have really huge markets, and they are going to treat or use for the treatment of all those like bipolar disease, pain, and influenza, and so on. And note that their targets are strictly controlled by circadian clock. And of course, we as a group, we also made a lot of contribution in that field to try to pioneering studies in a sense that and provide and how this clock really work at the molecular level. And the one piece of very important our contribution is that, and we in this study we identify the type of metabolites that is being is produced in different cells. And the question that we ask, what portion or how many metabolites production are under the control of this circadian clock? So this is really a very advanced type of information that I'm not going to talk about, but in order to make you believe me, and we did really a lot of metabolomics and bioinformatics and molecular biology work and so on. And we found out that 50% of detectable metabolites, their productions are under the control of circadian clock. So it was really is a huge impact in any field, because we know at the molecular level, protein level, and so on, and even at metabolic level, it seems to be that 50% of our metabolism or organic molecules are being controlled in a circadian dependent manner. Right, so now, so far, and organisms, they have a clock, and clock is very important in terms of evolution. Why? Because it's going to give an advantage to an organism to eliminate all those harsh environmental conditions and increase their survival fitness. And also at that point, and you have learned that these clocks are being generated by the genes, and now we have pretty much a good understanding of the type of genes that are being responsible for the generating of those circadian clock. So genes means that it's prone to having mutations, and if you look at the PubMed and if you do some type of search and just write circadian clock and SMPs, you will find out more than 100,000 papers basically. And all those papers, what they do is basically now they start to associate the mutations on clock genes with different types of diseases. And here you see very few of them. And they, for example, they discovered a gene on a clock gene called period, remember? And then they identified the mutation. And this is called advanced familial diseases. So those patients, they sleep 6 o'clock and they wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning. They sleep really early and wake up very early. Okay, they have a quite different sleep phenotype. Mutation on clock genes has a diurnal preference. It's clock with casein kinase has a reduced susceptibility to some type of mental problems. Also having a mutation again per different SNPs is having on and again and generally speaking with some type of sleep. Okay. And also mutation with the BMAL is associated with bipolar disorders, mutation on clock again and seasonal affective disorders. You all know this type of disease is related with the seasonal change. Again, mutation on PER3 is again associated with some type of bipolar disease, or that type of clock genes is related with autism, basically. Okay. So to make long story short, if you do not have a clock, a functional clock, and here I highlighted the major disease that you may get as a result of not having a functional clock. And the very first thing that happens when you do not have a functional clock, your immune system is gone. You have not really a functional immune system. So if you do not sleep like a couple days, maybe some of you have experienced, your immune system is getting crazy. And even small viruses, that is not going to cause major problem. But if you do not have viable clock, it becomes really a major problem. The second thing that is being most affected by the not having a clock is mental health, and depression is one of the form. If you have some type of the clock, and depending, of course, the genotype, other genetics factor, the very first thing that's going to happen is going to put people into the depression, and that's why the people who live in northern hemisphere, like in Sweden or Norway or Finland, and if you look at that, they have the highest suicide rate. The main reason is that basically they have no regular day and night cycle, and therefore they're having all those kind of mental problems. In order to eliminate it, they do nothing but drink alcohol. And that's how they cope with all those the clock-related problems, basically. Okay, but in addition to that, and as I said, our gastrointestinal system, cardiovascular system, reproductive system, breast cancer, they are all related with some abnormalities in clock, basically. So in that sense, clock is a top system that controls all other systems, because all other systems is going to work according to the time. If they do not have a viable time, everything is going to be messed up and cause all those different types of problems that you can think of. And also, we also found another mutation last year in Turkey. This is the one that I work with, the UPenn. And I collaborated with some group of clinicians at UPenn. And they basically were doing some type of study, people who has a major problem in going into the sleep. And I found a mutation in one of the clock genes over there. And when I functionally characterized those mutations, and I found that those mutation is basically interferes with transcription feedback loop mechanism. They do not have a functional transcription feedback loop mechanism. And those people, they have a problem to go into the, those people, they have a short sleep. So average sleep time for a normal person is about 8 hours. But if you have that mutation that we publish, is they just sleep for 6 hours. And those people is always having an attack, always a violence. They cannot, they cannot sleep. If they cannot sleep, they do terrorize all people that are around them, basically. Okay. And also the one that we discovered in Turkey is here is we found basically a mutation on Cryptochroman genes And we functionally characterized those mutations. And we found out that if you have that SMP or mutation, and again, by using the methods that is well established in our group, and so simply those mutations, they cannot generate rhythms. And those people who has those mutations has been shown that they are associated with this attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Okay. And of course, if you have a system, it has a huge impact in human health, and the scientists who did pioneer works, they were awarded by Nobel Prize. And therefore, in 2017, the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine went to these three gentlemen, Jeffrey Hall, Michael Rosbach, and Michael Young. And those three scientists are the one that did Drosophila work, and they basically proposed those transcriptional feedback loop mechanism. Okay, so how long we can talk?
That's okay. We can continue.
I don't want to take people's time, so okay. So now I want to really just briefly discuss what I did in my group, but also we're still working, and my group is interested in circadian clock in two aspects. The one of them is basically we are trying to identify the new clock genes or new clock components. That's the one of the research area of my group. And the second research group interest in our group is drug discovery. Because so far I said that if you do not have a healthy clock, there will be a problem. And of course, this one is immediately suggests you, okay, let's find the drug and correct all those clock-related problems and so on. And the second major interest in our groups, we are trying to find a molecule that basically correct all those clock-related problems. So in first group, so as I said, we are also interested in found a new clock component, and one of them, the way that you can find clock components is you can utilize different approaches. And one approach is you can mutagenize organism and ask question which genes are being basically changed and result in circadian clock. That's one possible approach. And that's the one is used by Konopka, if you remember. Or you can use biochemical approaches, try to find the new clock genes. Or in our group, we have developed, again, with my collaboration of the University of Pennsylvania, we have developed a machine learning approach, right? It's called Yapay Zeka. It's very popular nowadays. In 2014, we have developed this approach and try to identify even more clock components. And we published that paper in a very nice journal, basically, that you see here. So in this machine learning approach, what we did is basically our collaborator, he was a very, very talented bioinformatician. He developed all those different bioinformatic approach, and he said that, okay, these are the list, and seems to be that they are candidate for being a clock component. Then I pick one protein in the top called chrono and ask question whether this one is really a clock component or not, okay? And I don't want to really go into technical details, but we did a lot of different experimental approach, and we basically found out that, yes, the chrono is a clock component, and it stabilizes PMAL under certain conditions. And after publishing this, in that list, we have also found out that another important gene is called CBS that I'm going to provide you information in a minute. It's cystathionine beta synthase is an enzyme. I have discovered that is interacting with CBS. Then at Koç University, I asked my PhD student Sibel and show me that that's really interaction is really meaningful and it has some type of clock context. She spent 6 years and we published this paper, and it turns out to be that really cryptochroman is interacting with an enzyme. That's the first type of information in the literature, because usually the transcription factor, they do not really interact with some type of enzymes. But in this case, it seems to be that a transcription factor in the cytosol interacts with an enzyme called cystathionine beta synthase and regulate its activity. So what is cystathionine beta synthase, also known as CBS, is an enzyme, and human it catalyzes the first step of transsulfuration pathway from homocysteine to cystathionine. So in other words, it's a very important enzyme in methyl cycle. Okay, and here that's what you see, a methyl cycle. And this is a methyl cycle, and this cycle is provided, and one methyl group, remember epigenetics, some DNAs are being methylated, proteins are being methylated. And if you ask that question, where that methyl comes from, that methyl comes from this cycle. Okay, so that single methyl is comes from, and this guy is the one is chief in terms of regulating all these cycles. But it turns out to be that in the cell, this methylation, so how fast the cycle is going to regulate the other cycle, like urea cycle, like this production of serotonin, remember, is a very important hormone, tetrahydrofolase cycle, and all those are being integrated with this way. So if you fast, if you turn this cycle very fast, the others are going to be also they're going to also fast. If you slow down, everything is basically depend on each other. And here we found a CBS enzyme is interacting with a clock factor. So the question is, at that point, we thought that, okay, so all those cycles are being regulated according to the circadian clock by interacting with the cryptochrome. Sibel did 6 years, 5 to 6 years works, showed a lot of data. We have also edible data and so on. We did metabolomics and everything. Cut again, you do a lot of so many years work, and you have to summarize in one sentence. And since this is an evolutionary, some type of panel, and we found out that CRY, which is a clock factor, clock transcription factor, interacting with CBS during the nighttime, increases its activity and basically regulate arginine, methionine, and cysteine metabolism. And during the rest time, CBS going into the nucleus enhances the repressor activity of CRY1, and then in turn, tightly regulates these clock control genes. So note that in this case, just interacting enzyme and transcription factor regulates each other's activity. And with this way, cell saving their cellular resources. Because having such mechanism is going to eliminate transcriptional regulation, translational regulation, which is in terms of energy in cell, is going to cost a lot of energy, meaning it's costly. But having interaction between those two proteins is going to assign time information to the not only clock, but also to metabolism. Okay. And also we do drug discovery, as I said, and in drug discovery, there are different approaches that you can utilize to discover a molecule to regulate your target proteins. And here, that's what you see. You can have a natural product, so you can have an analog design, combinatorial chemistry, fragment-based approach. But the approach that we use is basically virtual screening. So in virtual screening, you have to have three-dimensional structure of your target proteins. So in that sense, what do we have is we have the crystal structure of cryptochromes, we have the structure of clock, we have structure of BMAL, okay? And also we have taken the crystal structure of those proteins that you see here. You see the crystal structure of a protein. If you have taken biochemistry course from I think you should be familiar with some type of representation. And here you see a ribbon diagram of the cryptochrome, and here you see clock BMAL complex structure together. So if you have such structure and if you know the active site of the enzyme, and then you can use computer or in silico screening and to find some type of molecules that binds to that active site. Okay, and that's what we exactly did. And we have the active site both on cryptochrome and clock BMAL. We performed a virtual screening, and eventually we find molecules that basically binds to the active site. So how do we define the binding? And again, if you take biochemistry from me, we define as a binding energies. And if we picked up molecules, they have the highest binding energy, and we assume that those molecules are going to bind and do something, the protein activities. Okay. And we published a paper in last year in this set, and we found a molecule that binds specifically clot proteins. Okay. And you cannot say that, you have to have a tons of biochemical and molecular experiments. This is the molecule that we basically discovered that binds specifically the clot at this site. And this is type of represent this conserved model. Perfectly fits here. It's the delta binding energy of minus 12 kcal in here. But we used a lot of biochemical and molecular approach and show that that molecule really binds clot and does something to the circadian clock. The major findings that we did is that basically this clock is enhancing the amplitude of the circadian clock. Okay, and this is again biochemical data, is indicates and so on. And why that is significant? Because as a human or mammals, generally speaking, when we get age, our amplitude is getting dampen. After certain age, basically we have no clock. So therefore, if you have elderly people around you, you will see that the sleeping pattern is different. They are more susceptible to the different kind of diseases and so on. Most of this as a result of not having a really functional clock. Oh, then at that point, we thought that this molecule can be a solution in a sense that if you can use as a medicine, the elderly people will have viable clock, and you will eliminate all those type of diseases. And then I don't have data here, but we work with an aging model of cell line called MRC5, and in fact we have shown that this clock molecule that we have discovered is interfering with the telomere shortening. And as we get age, what happens is our telomere is getting shortening, and it looks like this clock 8 is being important in a sense, is preventing or inhibiting telomere shortening. And now we received a grant, and now we are working with an animal and to see that what happens in vivo when you use this animal. Okay. And of course, I'm just a talker, but I'm not the one who do the works, and the works are being done by mainly my PhD and master students, and also my all other collaborators. And I would like to give me this opportunity to present really my work to you guys. So if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Okay.
Hocam, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. Mm-hmm. Is there any questions?
I can ask some question. Mm-hmm. As you know, nowadays it is arguable topic a little day. We in Turkey we use like yaz saati and kış saati, and like they argue that what is the suitable for the humans, like human's nature? Is it good to be in nights, like when we wake up it's still night, and is it good for persons to be awake in this time, or it causes stress? What is the logic behind this, and what is the solution?
Well, the solution is not change the time. Not change the time, but in a way that when you expose yourself and when you wake up, you should be expose yourself to the light. In Turkey, right now is not the correct one. Should be advanced 1 hour and not change basically. And nowadays we have a society, it's called American Society of Biological Rhythm. I'm also a member of them, and we do a lot of frequent meetings. And we are trying to raise the public concerns and government that this take the attention of governments, please do not change the time. And if you are going to change the time, and should be the time change and so on. There was a study done in United States, in Seattle, in Washington State, in Seattle. And what they did is basically, and some of the volunteer school, they haven't changed the time. and or they have to change time in a way that when students wake up, they expose themselves to light, and then they go to the school. The other schools that are being changed the time and they wake up early, no light, nothing, they have to go to school. And then they have measured their grading performance. And you know what happened? And the school that who didn't change the time, and their students perform 40% better grade compared to the other school. Directly, immediately, even because memory is controlled by circadian clock. So when you wake up, you have to send the signal to the brain that you're really waking up. How are you going to do that? Light. So light is important.
Okay, thank you. And I think the 30% is so much important rate. And another question, one of our friends sent through chat say that, is there any more check mechanism for the clock? Like, it's so important for life, and is there any like backward or backup mechanism when the clock is disrupted by the environmental conditions?
Perfect
is there any
question.
reference point?
Yeah. That's perfect question. So backup mechanism, no, but we have isoforms. Like for example, in human, we had 2 cryptochromes. Redundant function. If something happened to the ones, the other one can back up. We had 2 emails. We had 2 clocks. We have 3 periods. So in that sense, he or she is totally right. And if such system is important, you should have some type of backup mechanism. In clock perspective, we have isozymes, so isoproteins basically, or homolog proteins that performing the same function basically. Mm-hmm.
Okay, if there is no other questions, I have 2 questions.
Yeah, sure.
Hocam, we talked about the special drug you designed for the elderly people for the interruptions of circadian clock. And can we also use this kind of drug to cure jet lag of people like?
Yeah, nowadays people, we have molecules for the jet lag, but it's just still we are characterizing. But people taking like melatonin, when you change the time zone, what they do is because melatonin is being produced during the nighttime, right? So when you go to the United States, and based on the local time, you're going to take melatonin and send the signal to the body that you are basically nighttime, and maybe it's going to put you into the sleep. Or what people does is basically they try to arrange all those lighting stuff, artificial, and try to basically eliminate all those jet lag stuff and so on. But the right approach will be to reset the clock at the molecular level. So take a pill that clock BMAL is going to be, their activity is going to be regulated. And if you can regulate their activity and reset the clock, that will be the perfect approach. And that's what we do. Also, we have basically a molecule now is basically totally synchronizing the molecule at the molecular level. But let's see and how it's going to work at the animal level. But as I said, the best approach will be to regulate through those target proteins, core clock proteins, basically.
Okay, thank you very much, Hocam. And one of our friends asked that you said that people living in the poles are prone to depression due to irregularity of the day and night.
Correct.
Why don't people living there evolve a suitable clock for the place?
That's their home country, right? I mean, that's you know, they born over there and their family live and that's I mean, where are they gonna go? So, but government offers solutions for them, and one solution that they offer is basically, especially during the winter time where they have 3 months dark, so they make a light room, literally light room with a high intensity light. As soon as they wake up and they go into that such light and open the lights and they expose themselves to the highlight condition and send the information to the brain that is really being light over there, and they basically reset their clock. And they're trying to mimic nature on artificial conditions and to eliminate the problems associated with those improper clock, basically.
Okay.
So, and people somehow, they learn how to live with those conditions. As I said, they start to drink alcohol. And if you go Finland, you'll see they start to drink at 6 o'clock in the morning. All the way, all they do is drink. They basically try to have some type of solution. Maybe not scientific, but somehow they're having some type of habit which basically comfort them and forget those clock problems and so on.
Okay, are there any more questions? Actually, I have a final question.
Yeah, sure.
I was read about like a special disease. I think it's a different disease than we have mentioned in this presentation. It's short sleepers disease.
Short sleepers, that one that, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like in the research I read, it was like mentioned that like they're sleeping less, but there are no disadvantage of this situation, like in molecular level. But like, is there is like kind of a mutation that favors this like sleeping ability? Like, are always like there like must be a disadvantage of this situation?
So, is there any advantages if you look at in terms of phenotype? At least the one is it here? The one that we work on, yeah, this one, and that patient it was aggressive and going under attack, and violence is basically destroying everything. So as a treatment, what medical doctor did is they putting some type of, or they treating with some type of drugs that he can sleep for 8 hours for a week at the hospital. Then they feel okay, and then they discharge those patients. So my experience with direct experience with these short sleepers is there's no advantage, basically. It's opposite. Even schizophrenic people. And if you look at the schizophrenic people, they have periods where they cannot sleep, and they become violent. And also at that period, they totally have no clock, and they cannot sleep, and they become really and they acting really very weird, or they becomes aggressive, or they do all those weird things and so on. So when they hospitalize, again, what they do is basically they treat with a medicine that they will put them into the sleep for a week, and then they feel okay. So if you think the relationship between the circadian clock and sleep, if clock can send a message for the sleep, there will be a problem, mental problems, for sure.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, you're welcome. Okay. Dinlediğiniz için teşekkürler. Hoşça kalın o zaman.
Biz teşekkür ederiz hocam, zaman ayırdığınız için.
Oldu.
Teşekkürler hocam.
Hoşça kalın.